Welcome. In this video, we're going to give an introduction to New Testament ethics. That is, we will briefly overview the life of Jesus Christ as presented in the New Testament. We will describe the main categories of text in the New Testament. We will survey the main ethical ideas that the authors of the New Testament present. And we will identify several key questions for each of our New Testament readings. So let's start by looking at the life of Jesus Christ. I should stress, this is the life of Jesus Christ as presented in the New Testament, especially the books called the Four Gospels. I'm doing that because the later figures we will look at tend to take it for granted that this was an accurate portrayal of the life of Jesus Christ. So, according to the New Testament, Jesus of Nazareth was born in Bethlehem in the early 1st century. He was raised in Nazareth. At about age 31, he was baptized by John in the Jordan River. The Gospel according to Luke fills in the detail that John was his cousin. Okay. Baptism was a method by which people who were not Jewish became Jewish. John had kind of a surprising innovation because he was actually baptizing people that were already Jewish, which was a symbol of having lived a bad life, okay, and having changed your mind and dedicating yourself to no longer living a bad life. The term used later in the New Testament is a baptism of repentance. Repentance means stopping doing what you were doing before and behaving in a different way. So, Jesus was baptized by John in the Jordan River. He started an extending speaking tour, primarily in Galilee and Judea. He was arrested by the leading priests, handed over to the Romans for trial, convicted, tortured, executed, and buried on Friday afternoon. Executed here means executed by crucifixion. That means they took a cross, which was a wooden board with another wooden board, one wooden board going this way, one wooden board going that way, and they nailed his wrists and feet to the cross, and he died from that. Okay, it was an extremely painful and humiliating way to die, reserved for serious criminals, rebels, etc. Now, this happened on Friday morning through afternoon. So he dies on Friday afternoon, they bury him. There's Saturday. They don't really do anything because it's a day where you were supposed to rest according to the law. And then on the third day, i.e. Sunday, he returns to life. Okay. And then he appears to various people and he talks to various people after he returns to life. Okay. So that is the basic life of Jesus Christ as presented in the New Testament. Now, a note about names. I tend to use the term Jesus or Jesus Christ, or occasionally Christ. The New Testament uses the term Jesus Christos. Okay. Jesus is the Greek form of Joshua. Right? This is significant in two respects. It means savior, right? And Jesus was seen to be a savior, some people who saved people. And Joshua was also the person who took the Israelites into the promised land. Okay, Moses didn't get to go into the promised land. Moses dies, and then Joshua leads people into the promised land. Okay, so there's some symbolism in this. And Jesus was the Greek form of Joshua. If you read the Greek translation of the Old Testament from that time period, they always use Jesus for Joshua. Christos is the Greek word for Messiah or anointed one. Anointed means taking oil and putting it on the person's head. That was the way in which kings were crowned in ancient Judea, or ancient Judah. Okay. Now, there was a definite strain in Judaism up to that point that said that there would be someone coming in the future that was referred to as the Messiah who would bring in the time of universal peace. Okay, so it was going to be this incredible change in good change in human history. They were looking forward to this person coming. And of course, the Christians claimed that Jesus was the Messiah, right? Or in Greek, the Christos. Now, I use this term in particular because the New Testament was written in Koine Greek, and I don't know that we have much access to any other versions of the New Testament or any earlier versions. Some people would say certain parts were written in Aramaic or Hebrew. I think that's definitely true of Aramaic. I'm not so sure about Hebrew. Okay. And Koine Greek is a simplified form of Greek used widely in the Roman world. Now, presumably in his everyday life, Jesus of Nazareth would have been speaking Aramaic. We know that according to the New Testament, he read Hebrew. As far as I know, Hebrew was not a living language, right? But it was widely known as a scholarly language. Okay, it was read in the synagogues when they read the law. Okay, so I'm going to stick with Jesus Christ. Right? That's a variation of Iouseos Christos. It gets translated in different ways in different languages. So, with that in mind, the New Testament. Let's get an overview of the New Testament. Okay, almost the entire New Testament consists of three categories: the Gospels, Paul's letters, and the Catholic letters. Let's start with the Gospels. Each of the books is called the Gospel according to. So each of the four Gospels is said to be written by one of Jesus Christ's immediate followers or one of their students. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each of them wrote a Gospel, and it's called the Gospel according to that person. Each Gospel presents a slightly different perspective of the major events in the life of Christ. Okay. That is, I tend to assume that the writers of these Gospels believed that all the stories they were telling were true and historically accurate. At the same time, they didn't just give a list of stories. They very carefully arranged and presented them. Okay. So that's what the Gospels do. They give a presentation of the major events in the life of Jesus Christ. Now, common features. The majority of each Gospel describes the 2-year speaking tour. Okay, two of them talk about his birth and earlier life, 2 of them don't, but they all spend a lot of time describing the 2-year speaking tour, and they each end by describing the crucifixion and the resurrection. So, Paul's letters. Each of these letters is called the letter of Paul to, and the name of a city. So who was Paul? Paul was an apostle. That means someone who's sent out, like a messenger. He started by persecuting Christians. So he was involved in the killing of the first Christian martyr. He had a very dramatic conversion. Basically, he was going to another city in order to kill some more Christians, and he sees this blinding light, and he hears a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" So he has this vision of Jesus Christ after the resurrection, and he goes on to the city he goes on to Damascus, and he's been blinded by this intense light, and a Christian comes along and heals him. Right? So he converts to Christianity, and he travels around the Mediterranean, okay, talking about Jesus Christ in all these places and setting up little communities of Christians in each place. Eventually, the Romans execute him. So he's executed in Rome. I believe he's traditionally said to be executed by beheading. Now, Paul, during this time, right, during the time that he's traveling around the Mediterranean, he wrote a number of letters to the church in particular cities. The church means the assembly of Christians under the assembly of Christians under a leader or leaders in a particular city. Right? At that time, there weren't enough Christians in any city that you had these multiple different groups. Okay, so they all met together. So he wrote a number of letters to the church in particular cities, which were meant to be read aloud in the assembly of people. And they give general instructions and address specific issues. Sometimes they'll say, okay, you've been fighting with each other over this thing. Stop fighting. Or some people have been saying this, that's not correct. The truth is that. There are also letters known as the Catholic letters. Each of these books is called the letter of the person who wrote them. Each of them was written by an apostle other than Paul. They all give general instructions, and some address particular issues. And some of these seem to be clearly meant for circulation. So I was reading one recently that starts out by saying it's to the people in Bithynia and Asia and a list of things. Asia, I believe, would mean what we call Turkey. So a number of regions. And of course, pretty quickly, a lot of the letters of Paul and the other letters, even if they were meant for a specific purpose, got copied and circulated around for other people to read. Right? There's even, I believe, there were some fakes. I think there's a passage where Paul says, I didn't write this to you. Okay, someone said that I didn't write this to you. Okay. So at some point in the future, someone took the Gospels, the letters, and a couple other books, and they put them all together into a collection called the Bible. But they were all written as distinct books. So let me say something about interpretive method, or at least the way I approach the New Testament. The New Testament is not a modern philosophical treatise. Any theoretical discussions are contained in a narrative context. What do I mean by that? I mean it's either telling a history, right, and it puts speeches or statements or commentary within that history, or it's a letter being given to a particular group at a particular time, and as part of that, it gives some theoretical discussion. So with maybe one exception I can think of, there's no book that really seems to be sitting down and saying, okay, here's a theoretical treatment of a philosophical or theological topic. Also, each book is intended for an audience that is already participating in a church. As far as I can tell, all of these were meant to be read aloud in public within a church. But they're addressed to people that already have some experience of practicing Christianity. Now, an analogy I sometimes use is with a book for carpenters. It's not a how-to book for the average person who's never done carpentry. It's a book written to people that are already carpenters giving them instructions. Now, I say this for the following reason. We get a much deeper reading if we put the theoretical discussions in the narrative context. If there's a speech given by Jesus Christ in the Gospels, we get a much deeper reading if we look at the events in which the author has it take place. For example, I've noticed that in the Gospel according to Luke, he regularly starts things out by saying, when Jesus was speaking to this group. So it'll be when he was speaking to his disciples, or when he was speaking to the crowds, or when he was speaking to people who thought that they were better than other people. So Luke is very pointed about saying, here's what Jesus said, and here's who he was saying it to. And that often adds more layers to our understanding of the particular passage. Now, I'm not saying here that the authors didn't think the things they said were true. So I'm not convinced that any of the authors of the Gospels intentionally put in anything that they just made up. Right? But these are very carefully arranged. Okay, there were lots of stories. Right? They took some of them and they put them in a very particular arrangement, and we get a much deeper reading if we pay attention to that. Okay. So, approach to ethics. What's the approach to ethics in the New Testament? The New Testament tells people how to know, love, and serve God in this world and be happy with him in the next. Okay. I'm taking that phrasing from the Baltimore Catechism. Any passages about an abstract moral law independent of this goal are at most secondary. Any passages about how to be happy independent of this goal are at most secondary. That's not what the New Testament is aiming at. Now, there's a separate question of whether we can draw lessons for life that are independent of that. So lots of people have found inspiration in various things in the New Testament, right? But that doesn't seem to be what the authors were intending. I also add that I think it's often helpful if we're going to draw lessons out of it, right, to try to look at it in its original context and intention first, because sometimes that will give us a deeper lesson than we would have gotten otherwise. So, the New Testament instructs people in how to live if they believe two things. First, the meaning of life is to know, love, and serve God. And second, this can only be done through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So in order to really do this, a person has to have some connection to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, what exactly that connection is something that gets into some subtle discussions. Okay. But that seems to be the general gist of the New Testament. I would also add the New Testament always presents Jesus Christ as both God and human. Now, when I say that, this leads to a lot of debates about what exactly that means, okay? Ranging from people who say, well, it's a presentation as God and human, but he really wasn't God, to, well, presented as human, but really not human, okay? There's lots of debates and controversies here, but generally speaking, in the early years, there was almost no one who said he's simply an ordinary human being. It seemed to be more likely that they would deny that he was actually a human being at all than to say that he was simply a normal human being. Okay. So people interpret the New Testament in different ways, but at least on the surface, it's always presenting Jesus Christ as both God and human. I would also add that there is some places where Jesus Christ gives a basic summary of his teachings. Okay, so in several of the Gospels, someone asks him, what's the greatest commandment? And he says two things. The first is, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind, and love your neighbor like yourself, or love your neighbor as you would love yourself. I'm taking that from Matthew's version of his response. Okay. And notice, he deliberately connects this to the Old Testament. At least in one version of this story, he says, and this is summed up all the law and the prophets. Now, one thing about the New Testament is that it's full of paradoxes, such as telling people that the way to happiness is through self-sacrifice, or that you find your life by losing it, or giving it up for others. It's full of paradoxes, both in terms of belief and morals. And also, in terms of both belief and morals, the New Testament likes to lay out two complementary principles and leave people to figure out how to balance them against each other. So for example, it will tell people not to judge others, but it will also say in certain cases to correct people's behavior, or even under some circumstances, to expel people from the community. And so, but the New Testament doesn't give a tight, precise formula about how to deal with these two principles. It leaves people to work out how they're balanced against each other. Now, intellectuals end up spending an enormous amount of time trying to systematize that. And sometimes, right, what will happen is I'll just say for simplicity's sake, the church ends up saying, you can't systematize them. It'll basically say, no, that way of systematizing doesn't work. That way of systematizing doesn't work. That way of systematizing doesn't work. But right, we're left back with basically trying to work out how to systematize these things in practice. Now, some major themes that you'll find in the New Testament. One is kenosis, or self-emptying. The idea is that by sacrificing your own interests, by giving up a commitment to serving yourself, you find fulfillment. So through emptying yourself, you find fulfillment. Okay. In one of the famous passages in Paul's letters, he tells people to be like Christ, who, not considering equality with God something to be grasped, took on the form of a servant. But then, as he says, was exalted by that. So by placing yourself lower, you're raised up higher. There's also what I will call maximalism. There's a strong theme in the New Testament that says, don't try to figure out what your minimum duty is, just do more. So suppose someone was saying, well, this part of the law seems to tell me I need to give 10% of my crops to the temple or to the poor. Well, okay, what does that mean? Which crops is it referring to? Or a person might say, well, how do I calculate exactly what counts as 10%? Is that 10% of what I have more than last year, or 10% of everything? The answer the New Testament gives is just give 50%. And something which ties into the next point. Give 50% and keep reminding yourself that ideally you would be giving 100%. Right? So give 50%, don't congratulate yourself on giving 50%, and remind yourself how much less you're giving than you could have. Which brings us to the next point, recognizing your own lack of merit. merit, particularly recognizing that you could never deserve a reward from God or never deserve God's love. And with that, okay, not judging others. I tend to see these two as connected. Okay? Not looking at others and noticing their lack of merit. Another major theme is accepting unconditional love. So accepting love and forgiveness from God, which is done despite all the lack of merit on your own part. And finally, complete trust in and devotion to God. Those are some of the major themes in the New Testament. Now let me say a brief note about judging. In the New Testament, non-judgmentalism does not mean that there are no moral limits. At least if we treat it as a consistent whole, there's lots of times where it says to do things like expel certain people from the community. And it doesn't mean that we can't correct people. Now, it does mean that we shouldn't see ourselves as better than other people. It does mean that we are supposed to forgive people, right? Definitely once they've acknowledged that they were wrong, probably beforehand. And it means in a lot of other things. All right, so the rules about non-judgmentalism are very rule, but they don't mean that there is no kind of moral standard and that we can't do anything in response to other people's wrongdoing. Now, I say that, but here we get to the point where you have two complementary things. There's also times where it seems to mean letting horrible crimes go unpunished, or at least that's the way it gets interpreted later. Right? One of my favorite examples is St. Dionysius of Zakynthos. This is an island in Greece, who sometime, I want to say around the 16th century, lived there as a monk. And one day this terrified man comes up to the monastery and he asks to go to confession. And he confesses that he's just murdered someone and he's running from the police. And St. Dionysius realizes from the details, oh, I see what happened. He murdered my brother. That is, he murdered St. Dionysius' brother. So what does he do? He doesn't tell the man, I know you murdered my brother. Right? He accepts his confession, gives him forgiveness, and gives him some money and helps him escape from the police. Okay. So on one hand, Christian non-judgmentalism seems to mean that be compatible with there being moral limits, but it also does have this radical extreme. It also means if someone says, forgive me for torturing and murdering you, torturing and murdering your relatives, you're required to forgive them. Okay, so I'll leave that there. Now, in terms of ethical theory, the New Testament emphasizes two key arguments for morality. It's part of what makes a person truly happy, and we owe gratitude to God. So, and that definitely, and those two are carried over from the Old Testament. Okay. So there's a very definite sense that we ought to behave in certain ways because of everything that God has done for us, bringing us into existence, forgiving our sins, and very strongly, becoming a human being and dying, right, for us. Now, this brings us to the first of our two passages, the Sermon on the Mount. This sermon appears early in the Gospel according to Matthew. And let me say something about the context. The previous chapters set up parallels between Jesus Christ and Moses. These parallels indicate that there is some kind of parallel between the law and the Sermon on the Mount. Here's what I mean by this. The first chapter or two of the book of Matthew actually starts by using the word Genesis, which is the word for the first book in the Torah in the Greek translation. Okay. And it does other things that set up a parallel with the book of Genesis. Then it has Jesus go to Egypt as a child, which parallels Israel's descendants going to Egypt. He comes back out of Egypt. Okay. Someone was trying to kill him, which fits with another story in the life of Moses. And then he goes out into the wilderness, just like Israel went out for 40 years into the wilderness. In fact, he goes 40 days into the wilderness. And then he goes up on a mountain and gives the Sermon on the Mount, which I think it's pretty clear that it's deliberately setting up these parallels with Moses. Now, then what we make of that is something for discussion and interpretation. Now, some interpreters argue that we distort the meaning if we try to draw general ethical lessons. On one interpretation, the Sermon on the Mount works out what it means to regard God as Father, and particularly in relation to Jesus Christ. So here's an example. So I know someone that takes this line. And as I understand it, he'll look at the passage, famous passage about turning the other cheek. Okay? It says, if someone slaps you on your right cheek, you turn your left cheek and let him slap you on your left cheek. Now, some people take this as an argument for pacifism, right? And leaving aside the merits of that, on this interpretation, it needs to be understood as a person imitating or really uniting himself to the actions of Christ in not fighting back when people came to kill him. Okay? So some people will say you can't take it out of the theological context and really understand the meaning, right? Or at least you distort the meaning if you do so. So what are some things to look for as you go through the Sermon on the Mount? First, in what ways would it make life easier? That is, if you chose to really follow to the letter all of these things, in what ways would your life actually be easier? And in what ways would it make life more challenging? Okay. So at various times, Jesus Christ says, if you live the kind of life he's talking about, right, with the right kind of connection to him, your life will be easier and it will be harder. So what are the respects in which this seems to be true, looking at what's demanded in this passage? And what are some ways that the various passages might look different if you looked at them as general ethical advice or as a form of religious devotion? How would that look different? Now, our other passage is Romans chapter 7 and 8. These are from one of Paul's letters. These chapters appear as part of a larger discussion about the law, particularly how Christians are supposed to relate to the Old Testament law. There are several things to look for in these chapters. What role should the law play in a person's life? What are the limitations of the law? What picture does it give us of inner conflict? And does it give us any idea of how to deal with challenging situations? Let me spell out what I mean by challenging situations. There's times where it's difficult to figure out what to do in a particular circumstance. And there's times when it's difficult to do what you ought to do. Right? As some critics have said, we tend to focus more on the first question in the modern era for various reasons. So does this give us any guidance on what to do if A, we have to figure out what the right thing to do is, or B, we're finding it really hard to do what we know is the right thing to do? Now, let me say something about moral law, and this is mainly with an eye to what's going to be coming next week. The New Testament does not lay out a detailed moral law distinct from religion. Paul does argue that people can know something about God and about ethics through reason. I would also add that divine commandments clearly play some kind of role. The Old Testament law has some kind of role that seems to be generally agreed on. Okay, at least that seems to be said in several passages in the New Testament. But at the same time, it's very clear that Christians are not expected to follow all passages of it, particularly the dietary laws. And Jesus Christ does directly give commandments. So there's some role for divine commandments here. Those are three facets of the New Testament that later figures are going to have to work on and figure out how to understand and integrate. Now let me give what I call our two red herrings. Okay? Two red herrings in interpreting the New Testament. First of all, textual variations make very little difference. So it is true that we don't have original manuscripts and that there are variations in different manuscripts, so different accounts of what exactly particular passages say. But for our purposes in this class, certainly they make no difference. I only know of 3 or 4 passages that are a significant difference. Most of the time, it's literally, he went to Capernaum or he went up to Capernaum. Okay, so textual variations really don't make a big difference. And when there are major textual variations, there's usually something else that could be interpreted to mean the same thing. So I don't think very much rides on textual variations. Also, keep in mind that there was no point at which Christians were not arguing about beliefs and or conduct. Okay? So I say that to respond to 2 common misconceptions. First, they were never totally unified in belief, or if they were, it lasted a very, very short time. Okay? They were arguing about proper belief and proper conduct from a very early stage. Okay? Those conflicts are described in the New Testament. And second, they were never perfectly satisfied with the current set of disagreements. Okay? So I don't know of any period at which large numbers of people were saying, oh, we disagree on stuff, but that's fine. We don't need to settle disagreements. People can pretty much believe what they choose. Now, they might say on particular issues they weren't worth arguing about. They definitely said that at times. But the idea that there was a period where there was this very widespread, almost total agreement to disagree across the board on issues, as far as I can tell, that never happened. So there was always disagreement, but they were never content with the current set of disagreements. So bottom line, the New Testament presents a picture of how to know, love, and serve God. There are a number of specific ethical themes running through the New Testament. The New Testament does not perfectly systematize ethics. It does provide material that will be systemized in various ways at later times.